Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an incredibly fascinating and frankly pretty dense essay that totally challenges our fundamental understanding of racism. We're going to see how the source text attempts to shift our working definition of this concept away from a psychological feeling and toward a bureaucratic structure. It's a really deep dive, but a highly structured one, so let's get right into it.
So, the source material we're unpacking today is an essay titled, "Come, Let Us Deal Wisely." It essentially acts as a definitional argument. The author explores ancient biblical texts and even historical U.S. law to test out a very specific theory about how power actually operates in our society.
To make this complex thesis crystal clear, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the problem with a word, then defining the four terms, move into power before prejudice, look at law, category, and race, then address objections, and finally wrap up with the question of remedy. Okay, let's jump in.
Section 1. The problem with a word. We're going to start with the author's central observation about how society currently uses the word racism.
You know, you've definitely heard this phrase before. I don't have a racist bone in my body. The author points out that in our modern everyday usage, the word racism has been narrowed down to mean almost entirely a psychological feeling. It's become an interior state. And when we use it this way, making an accusation becomes entirely psychological, which generates these completely unfalsifiable defenses, just like that familiar phrase. The text makes the argument that while people are busy debating their internal feelings, the actual physical resource allocations in society are just left perfectly intact.
Moving on to Section 2, defining the four terms. To fix this linguistic gridlock, the essay argues we've got to separate what society has kind of fused together, and it introduces a strict four-part framework. First up on that list is prejudice. The text defines this strictly as an internal disposition. It's exactly what a person feels or believes about a specific group of people. According to the essay, this is entirely a matter of the heart.
Next, we have discrimination. And this is defined not as a feeling, but as an act. It's the discrete, documentable action that someone takes on a specific occasion. Think about things like, withholding an apartment lease or declining a job application. It's an actual event happening in the real world.
Then there's racial ideology. The author argues that this is merely the justification for an action. Look at it this way. If society is a giant machine, ideology isn't the engine powering it. It's really just the paint on the outside. It's the story we tell ourselves to make an existing arrangement comfortable for the people who happen to benefit from it.
Finally, we reach racism itself. And the text defines this not as personal animus or hatred, but as a standing structural arrangement of resource allocation. The absolute most critical claim the essay makes here is about sequence. It argues that power comes first. Prejudice is just manufactured afterward, merely to justify what the power has already decided to do. Section 3. Power before prejudice. Let's see how this all builds as the author tests this exact framework in what we can call the biblical laboratory.
Now, what is truly fascinating about this story is Pharaoh's framing of the situation. When he oppresses the Hebrews in the book of Exodus, he doesn't use any slurs. Actually, he claims no personal hatred at all. Instead, he frames his oppressive actions entirely as prudent demographic management and national security policy. He literally just says, "Let us deal wisely."
The essay points out that Pharaoh's power doesn't run on his personal animus. No, it runs on a massive administrative channel. We're talking appointed taskmasters, heavily capitalized construction schedules, credentialed professionals like midwives, budgets, and quotas. The mechanism is the oppression itself, regardless of how the chief executive happens to feel in his heart.
And this brilliantly sets up the author's next example from the book of Esther. So Haman has this deep, personal prejudice against the Jews. But the text points out that his prejudice remains completely inert, totally harmless, until the exact moment he gets his hands on the bureaucratic apparatus of the empire. He needs the king's signet ring, line-item financing, scribes, a deadline. The prejudice might supply the motive, but the state apparatus, that supplies the mortality figure. So the crucial point really comes down to this stark contrast. On one hand, we have Miriam from Numbers 12. Her prejudice was judged severely as a moral failing, but she held zero state power. She was structurally harmless. On the other side, we have Pharaoh, who possessed massive structural power but claimed zero personal prejudice. The author uses this to show that a personal sin and systemic state power are two very, very different things.
Which brings us to Section 4, Law, Category, and Race. Having established this baseline in ancient texts, the author then moves to historical U.S. law to prove a rather startling claim.
that racial categories are actually the output of racism, not the cause of it.
Looking at the colonial Virginia General Assembly, the essay charts how the colony continuously adjusted its laws over time. For example, back in 1662, they changed common laws so that a child's status followed the mother rather than the father. The author argues this had nothing to do with biology. It was a highly calculated move to convert financial liabilities into assets, ensuring a self-reproducing labor supply. The legal category was literally built to specification just to protect a property interest. To further back this up, the essay treats two 1920s Supreme Court naturalization cases as a sort of controlled experiment. In the first case, Ozawa, the court rejected pale skin in favor of strict scientific classification to deny citizenship. But incredibly, just 3 months later in the Thin case, when a petitioner used that exact same science, the court completely inverted its reasoning. They rejected science in favor of popular belief. The reasoning totally flipped, but the outcome, exclusion, remained exactly identical. The author argues the definition was simply adjusted on the fly to preserve the allocation of power.
Section 5. Addressing the objections. A robust explainer always has to acknowledge counterarguments, and the author dedicates space to addressing a few major objections to this structural definition.
One of the major objections is that this definition excuses the powerless, that it makes the concept totally jurisdiction-dependent. Well, the essay defends its thesis by comparing it to economic or legal terms. Think about it. Whether you have a monopoly depends entirely on your market position and structural arrangement. The author reiterates that personal contempt, like Miriam's, is absolutely still judged as a universal moral failing, but we simply cannot confuse personal sin with the heavy machinery of the state. And finally, Section 6, the question of remedy. Okay, so why does this definitional argument actually matter to us today in the real world?
Well, the author argues that your diagnosis always determines your treatment. If we as a society define the issue as a disposition, just a feeling, then our remedies are going to be apologies, etiquette, and sensitivity training, which, leaves all the money and power exactly where it was. But if it is defined as a structure, the only effective remedy is the hard, expensive, and incredibly slow work of actually reallocating capital, enforcement, and resources.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought from the source material. If we insist that this concept is strictly defined by what a person feels in their heart, haven't we basically granted every pharaoh in history a permanent and complete defense? If they never use a slur and only have a claim to be dealing wisely, are we completely blind to the machinery running right in front of us? It's a fascinating structural lens to view history through, and for sure, something to think about long after this explainer ends.